Good evening. I'm Alan Mucatel, the CEO of Rising Ground, and welcome to the first in a series of programs marking the 190th anniversary of Rising Ground. Tonight, you're part of the Rising Ground discussion series, 190 Years of Hope and Opportunity, Child Welfare and Social Service in a Rapidly Changing Metropolis. Since 1831, Rising Ground has helped New York City children, adults, and families find positive paths forward, first as an orphanage, and today as a leading nonprofit human service organization with more than 50 programs across all 5 boroughs of our city and Westchester County. As we commemorate 190 years of doing this work, this special program series brings together some of the leading experts to discuss the evolution of social welfare and social service. Tonight, we will cast an historic lens on New York City and how the care and support of the most vulnerable and marginalized has changed over 2 centuries. Rising Ground began as the Leek & Watts Orphan House in Lower Manhattan. It was created through the bequest of a vestry member of historic Trinity Church. To begin our journey through history, tonight we have a short video that connects the work of Rising Ground and Trinity Church's social services overall. This video is part of Trinity's ongoing series, Ask Trinity Archives. Here's the video.
Welcome everybody to Ask Trinity Archives. I'm Joe Lipinski.
And I'm Marissa Maggs.
And we are 2 archivists working in the archives at Trinity Church Wall Street. This year, Rising Ground is commemorating the 190th anniversary of the opening of the Leek & Watts Orphan House, the institution that would eventually evolve into the Rising Ground that continues to thrive and support New York's children, adults, and families today.
The connection between Trinity Church Wall Street and Rising Ground goes much further back than this year's joint discussion series. In fact, it goes all the way back 190 years to the opening of the Leek & Watts Orphan House, that very date that we are excited to be celebrating now.
John Watts Jr. was one of 7 children born to John Watts Sr., a wealthy Scottish immigrant, and Anne Delancey of New York's founding Delancey family. Watts Jr. went on to be appointed Royal Recorder of New York, an administrative colonial post, but a colonial post nonetheless. I stress this fact because sources point to Watts Jr. being a patriot, and as his career flourished and was elected to the New York State Assembly in 1791 and later to the United States Congress in 1793, Watts Jr. became the only government official in New York to serve both the English crown and later hold state and federal offices after the American Revolution.
In 1793, the only child of Watts Jr.'s younger sister, Margaret Watts Leek, died at the age of 8. The boy was the planned heir of his childless paternal uncle, John George Leek, who was also a close friend and brother-in-law of Watts Jr. It was decided that Watts Jr.'s son, Robert, would become Leek's heir instead, provided he took Leek's surname. In his will, Leek had stated that any heir must take the last name Leek, otherwise the money was to go towards the founding of an orphanage, quote, to foster, educate, and protect orphans. Robert never had the opportunity to change his last name, so the executors followed John Leek's wishes and founded the Leek & Watts Orphan House, one of the first private charitable institutions dedicated to child welfare.
The original site of the orphanage was in Lower Manhattan, and although we're unsure of where exactly, it was likely on Trinity land. And in 1843, the orphanage moved uptown to 112th Street in Amsterdam, a location which was eventually sold and would become the future location of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The orphan house was moved again to a spacious farm in Yonkers, where Rising Ground maintains a presence to this day.
The legacy of Leek & Watts lives on today through the work both Trinity and Rising Ground continue to do, providing services to those in need. From adoption and fostering services, domestic violence and social services, and always adapting to provide care for those who need it most, whether it be children suffering from HIV/AIDS in the 80s, or focusing on the education of preschoolers with autism today, Trinity Church is proud to be partnering with Rising Ground and their 190-year history of caring for New Yorkers.
I want to thank our friends at Trinity Church for producing that film, but most importantly for sponsoring this series both tonight and through the rest of the year. Trinity Church has been a long-time ally and partner with us. In fact, currently we receive support from Trinity Church in the form of a grant that supports our anti-gender-based violence work in our STEPS program, and we are grateful for that support as well. And now let's turn to the main portion of our evening's program. I'm really pleased to have three wonderful friends of Rising Ground and experts in the fields of history and of social work joining us tonight as we discuss child welfare and social service in a rapidly changing metropolis. First of our three panelists is Dr. Kenneth Jackson. He is the Jacques Barzun Professor of History and Director of the Herbert H. Lehman Center for American History at Columbia University. He is Editor-in-Chief of the Seminole Encyclopedia of New York City. Our second panelist is Dr. Linda Lausell Bryant. She is Clinical Associate Professor, Master Teacher, and the Catherine and Howard Eibel Executive in Residence at the New York University Silver School of Social Work. Her work focuses on building the leadership capacity of social workers to have a transformative impact on pressing social challenges. And Dr. Daniel Walkowitz. He is Emeritus Professor of the Social and Cultural Analysis and Emeritus Professor of History at New York University. His book, Working with Class, Social Workers and the Politics of Middle Class Identity, recounts the history of social workers from the 19th century to the present, with a particular focus on New York City. We are delighted to have such a esteemed group with us today. What I want to say to all of you who are participating, we're going to welcome your questions. You can type them into the Q&A that you see on your screen, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can towards the end of our program. All right, so we're looking forward to your questions. So, panelists, let us begin. Our first question: today's New York is clearly very different than the New York of 1831, when Lincoln Watts Orphan House and other orphanages, the predecessors of today's child welfare services, came into existence. What have been one or two of the through lines or themes in the evolution of how here in New York and across the country, things have changed in how we support those among us who need assistance? Dr. Jackson, can you start us off? So your thoughts on some through lines through this period of time?
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here because I feel connected to Trinity Church, where I was a vestryman for years, and I've been a professor at Columbia for most of my life. And Columbia was started by Trinity Church in 1754, and then of course with New York. So we feel connected. And Lincoln Watts was at the current location of Columbia University when Columbia bought that property in the 1890s, and Lincoln Watts moved north to Westchester. But anyway, in a way, it seems to me our topic today is New York City and human services. And Alan has asked me to think of a few themes that run through. There could be many, many themes. I do not mean to think this is exhaustive, but there are just a couple I wanted to mention. But especially in times of this pandemic, that cities can revive and thrive and then fall. The shores of the Mediterranean Sea are littered with the remains of great civilizations, and there are many of them. You think of Carthage, of Troy, of Ephesus, and many others, Knossos, Leptis Magnus, and then even in our own hemisphere, Machu Picchu, and others. And then there are cities, and those cities have disappeared. I mean, we're digging around looking for them, or found them, but I mean, there's just the remains. Nobody lives there. And then there are cities in America which have not really disappeared, but sort of, other than the mining towns in the West, which pretty much disappeared when the extractive resource ran out. But I'm thinking of some bigger cities that have declined. And, Detroit, which was the 5th largest city in the United States in 1950, and by some estimates, the richest, has now, of course, fallen on hard times and is barely in the top 50 cities. St. Louis, which had 853,000 people in 1950, and in the last census, 2010, had 300, lost 60% of its people. Cleveland, which was up to 900,000, and now 500 and something. Buffalo, which was over almost 6, and now is under 2, and we could go on and on. So there's nothing guaranteed about New York's future. And then thirdly, I want to, really secondly about New York is to say that it's been a leader in the provision of human services. Well, since Leak and Watts, or Rising Ground, began in 1831, but a few efforts even before that. But you can go through to the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, the Colored Orphan Asylum at 43rd Street and 5th Avenue, which was burned. And if you can imagine hatred so bad that you burn an orphanage, that's pretty serious, I would say. The whole settlement house movement, which we trace really to England, but really into Jane Addams in Chicago at Hull House. But it's really New York is the center of the settlement house movement, and not just University Settlement and Henry Street, and because there were dozens of them in New York. And that settlement house movement, which was really private philanthropy, evolved into the profession of social work, which is another discussion which we can have today, but which just transformed. And New York had a major role in that transformation. And then, of course, many provisions of public services that are publicly funded, and more so, at least in history in New York than in other cities. I'm thinking of the Department of Public Health, which is a major leader in New York. I'm thinking of public hospitals. New York at one time had 18 public hospitals. I'm thinking of public higher education, which is a provision. There are other things that we could think of right there, but the City University, but not as much as Europe. In other words, I think in this larger context, when we think about the provision of child services and human services, the United States is not normally a leader. I would say at the moment we're not a leader, and that's a theme. But New York has been resilient, and that's, I think, where we're going. Where are we going in the future? Who knows? But I would say that history suggests that there have been pandemics before. I mean, yellow fever in the 1790s, cholera in 1833 and 49 and 66, which was the classic epidemic disease of the 19th century, and which carried people away even more suddenly than COVID-19. There have been riots, not just beginning in 1964 in Watts and 67 in Detroit and Newark. The worst civil disturbance in American history, we think, the details are not great, were the draft riots in New York in 1863, which was really a breakdown of civil society. I mean, there are a lot of defenses for it, but essentially mobs in the streets controlled the streets for several days. And that's something to overcome. The fire, the Great Fire, I often get a lot of dispute about this, but New York City has not had a fire since 1835. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. Not a really big fire that the fire department couldn't put out. So fire department didn't even exist until 1865, and there's never been a fire like there has been in Baltimore or San Francisco, Boston, suburb. With, fire, we go on for days, not in New York. So I think what we need to do, and the problem, which is a theme running through American history and certainly is relevant to our discussion today, is the problem of decentralization in the United States. Yes, we have a dozen super aircraft carriers and we're the strongest nation in the world, but we are very decentralized. I mean, compared to Japan, which has, well, let me just say this, we have 13,000 school districts.
So,
Japan has 64.
So, Dr. Jackson, I think I'm hearing from you two themes that I'm hoping to juxtapose those with our other speakers. One was about the resilience of our city.
Yes.
The other is really about New York City as a leader of human services and public functions in various ways that have endured. Dr. Lausell, Bryant, what are some of your thoughts about the through lines in the evolution about how we support the most vulnerable in our city? What comes to your mind?
Thanks, Alan. And one, I'm just already fascinated with appreciation for the role of history and putting things in context. So I'm thinking about what Dr. Jackson was talking about, and the through lines that came to my mind were themes that seem to persist throughout the history of human services. One is the debate, the perennial debate as to whose responsibility is it to address the need for assistance? Is it government's job? Is it the private sector's job, charity? Like, who's responsible? I think that's a question that anyone who's trying to provide human services has to be able to address, and we have to contend with those forces in the larger social fabric that we're trying to deliver human services in, right? Because there are such strong opinions on that. I think the concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor is one that has persisted throughout our history, and I'll let the historians correct me if that's accurate in terms of history. And that link to morality, that somehow someone who's in a condition of need may somehow have some shaky moral ground, right? And our need to constantly overcome those perceptions. And I would say the third through line, in my opinion, is the impact of racism throughout all of our efforts to deliver human services. And I think those things also have played out in the social work profession, which has committed itself to delivering social justice and system change, and yet has found itself evolved into a practice that is more focused on micro level or individual level interventions rather than larger systemic interventions. In fact, social workers are the leading provider of mental health services in the United States. A great achievement. I think that's wonderful. And I'm also always concerned about who's going to pick up the mantle of social change and structural reform. How well is our profession doing in terms of that part of the work?
Okay, so different through lines was hearing from you. Whose responsibility is it to take care of our most vulnerable members of our society? Who's deserving and undeserving, and how does racism, which is embedded in the structure of our country from its very founding, how does that play out in this work? So, Dr. Walkowitz, what is your take on the themes that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, let me echo Ken's thanks to Rising Ground for organizing this session and for inviting me to participate. I'm delighted to be here and have an opportunity to do this. Secondly, I think it's pretty obvious the kinds of things that my two co-participants have argued and suggested are easily themes on which I could piggyback. It's really just about nuancing some of these questions and adding to them a bit. So the way I would articulate my two through themes would be to begin by probably talking about the struggle over the various role of the public and private sectors in America. One of the things that's distinguished the United States from other countries has been its reluctance to embrace, to the extent to which Europe has, the welfare state. It's been at best considered often a kind of semi-welfare state. And there's been a long history in which it was generally presumed that responsibilities, deprivation were caused by individuals, that the problem that most people had was what we would describe as a personal pathology. It was their own moral failures. It wasn't a social failure. The problem wasn't something that society had to do. Rather, it required self-help. So a lot of the early philanthropic movements and charities were really in response to the need for self-help, and they put a lot of pressure on local ethnic groups to help themselves and help their own communities. So it's not this was true of the Catholics, it was true of the Jews, it was true of the Italians, it was true of the Irish. They all formed ethnic organizations to support themselves, including the Hebrew Orphan Asylum of New York, for instance, which was one of the earliest asylums. The one, however, that made the greatest mark on all of this is not untelling, is the orphan training movement, which comes out of Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. And it suggests ways in which I would simply argue that the issues about New York's resilience and vitality are complicated. And even New York's leadership is sometimes leadership in fairly problematic ways. To give you just one brief example, a recent historian writing about the Children's Aid Society summarizes it by notes that many of the children were destitute and homeless, but the abiding notion of help was troubled by the ethnic biases of the Protestant reformers that ran this place. Brace was a Calvinist minister. The summary on his account was that his remarks were that Brace thought that these poor Catholic immigrants were, quote, genetically inferior, deeming them, and I'm quoting, a stupid foreign criminal class, the scum and refuse of ill-formed civilization. So it meant taking these kids and taking them away from their families and believing they could go elsewhere. So these were problematic kind of institutions, even when they were in fact dealing with some major problems that people had. And they suggest the ways in which we talk about responsibility. It means also then thinking about how is responsibility understood and who's taking that kind of responsibility and under what terms. It also suggests that the issue of, I would say the issue of race is both crucial and too narrow, because race is historians we've come to understand is a socially constructed category, and it meant some of the most important books in the last 2 decades have been about things like when the Irish became Black folk, when Jews became Black, when Italians became Black. And it suggests the ways in which these groups were often stigmatized in our culture and society. And even within them, it's not incidental that the Hebrew Benevolent Society, for instance, was formulated and run by German Jews to deal with their poor Eastern European Jews. So let me just finish by saying the second theme that I think this all moves to in terms of responsibility is to what are people entitled? And it seems to me the real movement into the middle of the 20th century are opening up notions of entitlement. And in that question, I would only say that I think it meant understanding the ways in which social workers, clients, activists, and the state all understood and gave voice to what those entitlements could be. And they didn't always agree with one another or even amongst themselves.
So thank you.
Let me jump in just for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
To endorse a couple of things that have just been said. One is to follow up on what Linda said, the dispute over who's responsible, the public or the private. And this is very much contested right now in 2021. I suspect most of us feel like the public needs to have a bigger role, but there are tens of millions of Americans who say sink or swim. And that's kind of in public housing and lots of other ways. That's been true all along. And then with what Danny said, the orphan trains, that shows how history is complex. Because on the one hand, many of those people, they were Protestants. They thought that you get these kids out of this Jewish, mixed ethnic, messed up, loud, violent city and take them to Nebraska or somewhere. And the emotional problems of maybe being separated from your family member. If you're sitting on a train and somebody wants your sister and not you, and the train's pulling out in 10 minutes. I mean, you can't even imagine that. But the larger point, I would think, is that they thought they would, some people at least thought they were doing good to take them. But if you think of American history writ large, actually the place that people did the best in terms of upward mobility, if that's what you're trying to achieve, is New York City. I mean, everybody, whether they moved, it's always been a place to make it, from the very poor and to the extent that historians have studied this, they've generally concluded that New York City had the highest upward mobility, where the worst mobility is probably on a farm. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have a high quality life. You know, in all sorts of ways, it would be superior to the Lower East Side.
And fresh air.
What?
And fresh air.
Yeah, fresh air. Okay. But the chances of your making it in life were not as good as if you maybe even sold newspapers on the streets of New York. At least that's an argument. I'm not saying it's true.
Well, I think, and first of all, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Jackson, to your pro-New York stance in every possible way. I'm going to embrace that in the biggest point. I think one of the things that the three of you touched on that I want to come back to, and it started with your comment, Dr. Jackson, about New York as a leader. Dr. Lausell, Bryant, you touched on to it about who is responsible, and then Dr. Walkowitz, you followed through on this discussion about public versus private sector. What has been the role of the most prominent actors? And I think they fall in a couple of categories. We've talked about government, religious institutions, philanthropy, in shaping the work of human services, of taking care of individuals. And how have the fact that these actors have been part of this mix really had an impact? Dr. Lausell, Bryant, you want to take that one first?
I know that, there was that shift in the 60s from more government funding into really contracting with the private sector, the voluntary sector, as we call it. And I think that has had some pluses and some minuses, and actually is very related back to that issue of whose responsibility is it? We keep coming back to that question. With government providing a good level of resources to address the needs of the vulnerable, it at least sends the signal that there's a collective responsibility. Now, in contracting with the private sector, I think one of the challenges has been how we respond to market forces, how all of us are trying to provide human services in a marketplace where we have to be competitive. We have to compete with one another. We're doing that right in this larger capitalist economic system. So we have to compete with one another, and we are more compelled to have to make the case as to why the people we are representing and we are trying to serve are more deserving of the services. And I think that is another perennial tension, right? Are we more concerned about the children you are trying to serve in foster care? Should we be more concerned about the kids who are having literacy issues in their schools? Like, how do we make those distinctions as to whose need is greater? And when you think about market forces, there's also the issue, and this has become a big thing, as we know, when we're raising money. What's the return on the investment? What's the ROI? How do we calculate an ROI on a child's life? Is it even ethical to calculate an ROI on a child's life, right? But you and I both know, Alan, when we've been writing proposals, we have to do that. And so I think, what the ideal mix is, how much government, how much private sector. I think we've got to deal with the challenge of doing this with kind of like a market mentality. And the need to justify with that market mentality that this is a good investment. I have been told by funders that the young women that I served when I was executive director of Inwood House really complicated the ROI because they were touched by so many systems that it was hard to calculate whether our interventions were the most important. Was it ACS? Was it the school system? So they didn't fall neatly into that algorithm. And the reality was that they had needs that needed to be addressed, whether they fell into that, whether they had a high ROI or not. So I submit that, I think, as a challenge of not just who have been the most influential actors, but what's been that connection between those actors.
Interesting. Dr. Walkowitz, what's your take on you got a very passionate component to that, and what you were speaking of. What's your thought on this?
It's a challenge for me to respond, because I have to say, the discussions of I'm a little leery about using this word, so apologies. Reducing this to the level of investment on something as a capital investment is so foreign to the kind of discourse that I'm comfortable with. So it's a little hard for me to respond. I begin though with a point that Ken made that I think is true. For the last 200 years, an abiding debate that still is present today and marks all the debates about all the services we're talking about is whether is still the division over a medical and social model. Should people be doing this through self-help, or does the state have any business of pulling them up? Is there a waste of resources? It's the echoes of social Darwinism. You can spend this money, but it's a waste of money because these people are basically lazy and they're just going to fall back on their feet again. And that continues to be a discussion that marks the profound divisions in the body politic today, and a deepening division, it seems to me, that continues, and makes me, very leery in particular, therefore, of wanting to reduce it to what is essentially, ironically, the conservative desire to reduce this to dollars and cents, which is not where I would have it. Let me return, however, to the question that you asked, Alan, in terms of the players. I think in the 60s, the important players were the welfare rights movement. And what's interesting about them is that it actually, two of the organizers are Columbia professors in social work and sociologists, and they become deeply involved in a social welfare rights movement that includes some of the daughters and granddaughters are running for office today, including running for mayor today, Wiley. But that was striking because it was both from the bottom up, where clients were making demands about what they deserved, as well as social workers together as a kind of joint effort. The second moment in which however, an earlier moment, which a lot of this really was defined, was the 30s. And that really came out of a New Deal, and the New Deal, the origins of that is very much a New York story. Ken Jackson is exactly right, of course, in all of this. Most of the early New Deal policies were New York State policies initially, and they came from people like Frances Perkins, who cut her teeth on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and then comes back to become Department of Labor Director. So in fact, a lot of the early policies about social welfare and the notion that there ought to be welfare rights, a whole range of them, including social service, including occupational health and safety issues, all are defined, and they're defined by state actors, but they're defined also again by social work activists, and they're defined by social work activists who are in left-wing parties. Many of them are communist activists during the 1930s, who then are wiped out basically in anti-communist actions in 1950. And the result of that leaves the social work movement really profoundly conservative in the 1950s. And it becomes so there's kind of yin and yang in the movement, where they increase social services to the poor and to immigrants in the 30s and 40s. And then they cut back, and they begin increasingly in a kind of conservative 1950s. The discourse and debate becomes: are women hiding are black women hiding their men under the beds, and are they the undeserving poor, and they shouldn't be getting these benefits? So there's kind of been a yin and yang in which clients, social workers, activists are all involved in debating this, and they're doing it in the context of a public discourse which is deeply divided, both in the Republican Party and outside, and in the Democratic Party and outside them, historically from the 1830s right through to the present, over whether services are deserving or not deserving. And I'd like to say New York is going to be the leader in all of this, but New York is right now an outpost compared to some of these other places in trying to provide, preserve, and maintain many of these policies. They're not being sustained. You can go to New York and Oakland, California, but in between there's and some cities, but it's a major struggle going on.
Dr. Jackson, what's your take on government, religious institutions, philanthropy, all of which are very rich here in New York City, and their role in shaping our human services infrastructure?
Well, of course, you can argue that if you're wealthy, your wealth in part depends on doorman and taxi drivers and everything else, and you, by any kind of moral obligation, ought to help support that. But then there's another, just to before New York right now, is the governor's budget, which is going to require, at least propose, a millionaire's tax. I'm not going to be hit by that tax if it comes in. But the issue about that is that as we stand now, communities have different tax rates and provide different services. And a lot of affluent suburbs, and I'm not going to pick on Bronxville, but let's just say that's a wealthy suburb. And it has excellent schools and public services and things like this, because that's where its taxes go, to the local community. Not so much the poor. There's no public housing in Bronxville, and so the number of poor is fairly small. And the overriding problem in the United States, or an overriding problem, is that you can escape these responsibilities by changing your address to Greenwich or Florida or wherever it is, and opting out of any responsibility for taking care of the deserving poor. And that's simply built into the American Constitution, and it frustrates most of us all the time. It's not just that issue. There are a lot of issues that we wish could change, but I think those are basic. Zoning is something we never think about, but lots of very liberal people live in communities where the poor can't come. And I don't know, you necessarily can't say they're crazy, but it's not possible in Germany or Australia to do the same thing, because you have the government that's responsible for things is in a much geographically bigger organization. And so you can't escape what I would call your moral responsibility to contribute to the welfare of the poor. Biden is trying to change that now. It's very hard to redistribute wealth at a local level, because all I got to do is walk across the boundary. You can maybe do it at a national level. Still some people who are going to move to Bimini, but basically, where I don't even know if Bimini's in the United States, but you can go somewhere else. But I think Biden is certainly aware of this issue, but whether you can do anything about it or not, or much about it, you can do something. And he probably is trying, but it's a basic problem.
Mm-hmm. I think the three of you have touched on it, and you started us off, Dr. Lausell, Bryant, and this notion of, in part, the dollars and the role of, and especially as we speak today, where government plays such an important role in the provision of human services. It's the greatest payer for it. I guess that would be different than in 1831.
And we should say, Alan, yeah, New Yorkers probably as a broad group are more willing to share some of these burdens than people in other places. I mean, there is a point where they're not, but no, I think in general, people self-select themselves in New York. They want to be part of the tumble and the tide. They like diversity. They feel responsibility for their fellow man or woman. We have tried. New York has tried. I think so.
I like that you have again made that you are promoting New York, and I'm with you 100%. With that in mind, yeah, we only have a few minutes left before we want to open it up for some discussion and some questions from our listeners and viewers. Given some of these themes that we're talking about, and we've covered a lot, and we've not been able to go in depth in hardly any of them, right? Because it's a long history, it's a complex system. But when we're thinking about this very founding of an orphanage 190 years ago, completely by one private individual and wealthy, and talked through some of the things that have happened in the course of 200 years that have impacted society, and right now we're in the middle of a pandemic that has impacted people by race and class in ways that have been very disparate. Where do you see human services going? What are some of the changes we are seeing in New York society that might impact that? So let's end in a futuristic looking view. And Dr. Walkowitz, will you take us there first?
Well, I can try. As I've told you before, it's above my pay grade to talk about the future. But I guess the one thing I will say is I think philanthropy has run its course. At the same time as there's enormous good news in the philanthropic world because of the actions of some women who have inherited great wealth from their husbands in the internet world and are divesting themselves of all of that money with enormous gifts. We see that in 2 or 3 instances, and the Gates seems to be are trying to do a lot of that as well into human health and human services. But ultimately, I think what we learned from the late 1920s and the onset of the Depression is that there ultimately isn't enough money in philanthropy to solve the problems of inequality in this country. And ultimately, philanthropy is a troubled way to do that. It's not an accident that when we talk about the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, et cetera, they bear so little likeness to Carnegie and Ford themselves. They've taken on a different life and a different kind of perspective as to who those people are. I go around the world lecturing and talking about Jewish heritage. And when I do these tours, they always want to talk about Jewish philanthropists. And when I gave this lecture at the Jewish Museum down in New York, somebody said to me, "Oh, I know about that guy, that philanthropist. His name was Israel Poznansky. He's the largest manufacturer in Lodz, Poland." And they said, every year at Passover, they would talk about Israel Poznansky and they would go, "Pooh, pooh, that thief." So what happens when the history of philanthropist is a title that philanthropists bestow on themselves, but the recipients may not think of them as philanthropists, but rather as exploiters who, after all, they got their money by paying them low wages to begin with. And then they decide how to use their money. And they're the ones who make the decisions about how it should be used and for whom it should be used. So I'm all for taxing the devil out of those people and letting some other entity make that decision, though to be honest, I'm not sure I have great confidence that another entity is going to be any more benighted in thinking about how those decisions will be made. But I think the future is going to have to come from other kinds of concerns. And the one that Ken has highlighted in thinking about, I guess he wanted to talk about the enormous, not diversity, but the localness of American institutions. The truth is, states' rights have a long legacy. They go back to the Civil War, but they persist, and they make it very hard to do anything. You just move to New Jersey, you move to Florida. I mean, it's not just moving within New York State, but they really just easily, in the tri-state area, they just move across the river. And they can do all those kinds of things. And changing that mentality, changing a way to deal with that. Right now, after all, the Electoral College is states' rights. This is a major set of rethinking and hurdles to leap. But I think any kind of profound change is going to have to be done probably on the national level, and it's going to face some major obstacles in doing it. And I don't look for rich people being the solution to those to those problems.
Dr. Jackson, what's your take on the future and caring for all members of our society?
Well, I agree with Professor Walkowitz that to depend on the generosity of individuals, while there are some incredible examples of generosity, I think, still most people have their individual challenges and families first in mind, and they'd rather take another canoe trip somewhere than add another $100 to their tax bill. In other words, I think the future, I'm just trying to be an optimist. I think the future is relatively bright. I think people are basically good, and the challenge is somehow to convince them that we're all in this boat together, and that if people have nothing else to lose and are out riding in the streets and risking their own lives, that's not a good place for the nation to be. And I'm hoping that that persuasion, moral persuasion, other things will help 51% of American people, and that's about where we are, a little more than that, but not much, that we need to go this new way, that that selfishness is not really ultimately the American way. I don't think it is. Got a long legacy, and it's got a lot of constitutional and historic supports to it. But I think that we can try to trust in the wisdom and generosity of the people themselves, because I don't know how else you can do it, because there's a lot of evidence out there that unfortunately we see every day, and you wonder, how can people actually believe that stuff? But they do. And I think this is another, I think the internet's part of the problem. There used to be 40 years ago, the National Review and these conservative magazines, they were conservatives, but there was a kind of a gatekeeper. They had smart people running them, and you couldn't say, now you can say the Jews blew up the World Trade Center. I found that absurd, but there are people, even though we saw the planes, say it was blown up from the bottom and there were no Jews in the building. Anybody can say any wild, crazy thing, and somehow it can get picked up and repeated millions of times about the COVID vaccine, about this or that politician and his or her alleged affairs. Everything can be magnified. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that we have no rules of the game. Like, we have to kind of agree on some facts here, and we don't seem to agree on the facts right now. And I think that's a big problem.
Lausell, Bryant, your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I want to just pick up on Dr. Jackson's consistent optimism. I think it's important to hold on to that. We are in a very important moment in which I think there's the potential for things to be very bright. One of our strengths, especially here in New York, I think about the numbers of committed people who make the serving of people who are less fortunate their reason for living, their total devotion. And we have so many of those people here in this city, which is amazing. But I think some of the opportunities that may come for the future are, one, there was this moment in which we began to recognize during this pandemic that people who we had totally overlooked and ignored were now essential. We're now deemed essential. I hope we can rethink how so many people in our economy are really essential to all of us, and begin to appreciate and value what they have to contribute. And that includes human services workers. I think we have a chance to be more proactive now rather than reactive. We've had this experience with the pandemic. How can we prepare ourselves and prepare this sector to be equipped to respond to the unexpected, whatever that may be? And I'm hoping that with the increasing attention to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we can figure out how to create a more integrated cake as a metaphor for our society, and not just one where we throw some diversity sprinkles on top, right? Where it's not just cosmetic, but where we really work on recognizing that if I'm going to be okay, we have to be okay.
So I want to just add one comment, and that's to remind people, at least from my perspective, that Black Lives Mattered, for instance, mattered. And it mattered because it awoke into kind of public consciousness and awareness of things. And I think part of the difficulty is the ways in which protests, especially in social media discourses that Ken alluded to, protest becomes equated with rioting, and it is not. The March on Washington was not a riot. Even Occupy, which really changed the discourse about the 1% or raised questions about privilege and inequality, and fundamentally, I think, changed at least an awareness of the gross inequality in the last part of the second decade of the 21st century, mattered. That was not rioting. What happened on January 6th, was a riot. And so and yes, I think we want to be we want people to not take to the streets in those terms, but I think we have to also recognize that it's been protest movements, whether it was the civil rights protests in the 60s, or whether it was Occupy, or whether it was Black Lives Matter, that have mattered. But we can't allow them to be debased as rioting, which is what happens in the social media discourses.
So we have a question that came from one of our participants that I want to ask, and maybe as you're answering the question, I guess it's interesting, you have all turned us to this discussion about a national collective responsibility, I think is where we're winding up, and how very different that may have been from where the founding nation started, right? Or maybe part of those tensions were part of the creation and founding of the country. The question that comes up, and I guess it's almost tied to how things are different between now and then. So the question that's being asked from one of our participants is, why were there so many orphans in 1831? And how, basically, I would add to that, how does that compare to where we find ourselves today? I guess I'll turn to our two historians in this particular question, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Walkowitz. The orphans, where are they? Well, why were they there then?
Well, I'll just start. Danny probably knows this better than I do, but just a few quick responses were that there was no or very little birth control in the middle of the 19th century. So people did have children that they did not expect or want. Or since we didn't really have a kind of a social security system that provided some sort of floor for parents to get a job, you couldn't afford them. We did a exhibition at the Historical Society on the orphan trains, but partly the orphan trains were about, in some churches around the city, there would be, for example, a nun whose job was to sit there by the door. And when somebody left a baby in a cradle, to go get it and bring it in, because it happened so often. There was a giant Catholic orphanage in Staten Island within the last half century. I mean, giant. I want to say it's Mount Loretta, but something like that title. I mean, really big. So lack of birth control then. Now there's obviously birth control. There are various kinds of aid to, I forget I don't even know what they call it anymore, but I mean, there's various ways in which the government will try to keep you from starving. And there was no such thing as that. And what I feel was the pain of the mothers. I remember a note that a mother had penned to her son's, whatever it was over. It says, "Please call him Henry." And other than that, it's goodbye. You will never see this child again on this earth. And it was an act of love for many people. They wanted the baby. They loved it. They were attached to it, but they couldn't provide for it. I think that's a human tragedy of gigantic proportions. And so now we have, people can, I think that's a good thing. People can choose, or many people can choose whether to have a child or not. And many people love it. What's the greatest event in their life? The birth of their children. But it needs to be a decision in part that we want this to happen. We are ready to sacrifice during our lifetimes for somebody we don't even know yet. Everybody can't make that choice.
So I'll say a couple of things. One is, of course, in the present period, we're talking about enormous restrictions on birth control in the United States, not birth, but on abortion rights. So, of course, we've created a political climate that facilitates the increased level of children that are not necessarily wanted by their mothers, the pregnancies that they don't want. So that's part of the formula. And of course, we saw recently on the southern border, immigration policy created orphans, because we simply took kids, away from their parents. We created orphans, if you'd like. But that's not the big numbers that you're thinking of. I guess I would suggest that 1831 is really coincident with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of modern urban industrial cities. And the making of the modern world was also a profound change in the understanding of children. So the category of the child, and much later in the 20th century, the teenager, are new categories. Childhood was there were new understandings about children because so many of them died in childbirth, because so many parents had children all the time. Children weren't thought to be quite so precious. They dealt with it. They didn't. It was a terrible thing for anyone who lost a child. I wouldn't want to minimize that, but it didn't have the kind of resonance it has in the modern world where we think children are precious. It didn't have, but in fact, in the 1830s, that attitude is changing and it's beginning to be adopted. And that's part of, it seems to me, the coincidence with the rise of a kind of modern, a modern society. And it's also coincident with the rise of immigration. Of course, it's a little early, but it's the beginning, the widespread Irish immigration we associate usually with 1846 and the 1840s and the German immigration, but they're really here in the 20s and 30s. And they're here at the same time, of course, that of cholera epidemics are going to begin quite after that. So I think that there are, concerns about these strange people there who are raising kids in situations where they're not able to do so, or not giving them the kind of wholesome environment that more reformers would have liked them to have had. But I think that the 1830s are really it's coincident with the rise of an industrial revolution and new attitudes about children.
That makes me think of a question for Dr. Lausell, Bryant, and Dr. Walkowitz around, I guess, some of the transformation that happened more in the late 20th century about believing more in the inherent strength of families and investing in families, not so much as to lead to not there being orphans, but in much about keeping families together and recognizing how strong families lead to more successful adults, and what the repercussions for that may be. That is another theme, I think, in some of the latter part of the change in human services. Any thoughts about that as a latter through line? I don't think that was part of the thinking in 1831.
That's probably, you're right. I feel like that definitely is something that evolved later. More, I think, of a recognition of the sanctity of the family, the importance of the family. And I'm not sure, I mean, Dan, maybe you can speak to that in terms of history, where that emerged from. But I know we have certainly seen those moves throughout our profession, right? Where that is emphasized more, where interventions are more targeted towards families. Yeah.
Well, aid to families and dependent children, again, is a New Deal policy. That's again, it's on the federal level. It started initially as New York state policy. Roosevelt, as you know, was governor here, goes there, brings some of the state policies become the federal policies, and aid to families and dependent children is a cornerstone of the new federal policies. So it's the one I think to which Ken was alluding. Social workers had always begun increasingly. You have to understand that the origins of social work as a profession, which are really the first part of the 20th century, settlement houses are an important part of that. And it marks the ways in which early social work was not about becoming what I called in my book discount therapy, which is what they become in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it was about doing community organizing. It was social, it was group work, it was industrial social work. That's what the early social workers did. And one of the kinds of things they did, for instance, is they did budgets for families. Now, they were full with all kinds of middle-class assumptions about how people ought to live and what they should be spending their money on. It wasn't untroubled work, but it was fundamental to understanding that the family had to sustain itself. It was an important unit for keeping working class and poor people together. And that project also begins with the rise and development of social work as it tries to make itself into a profession rather than simply as a group of people who are demeaned really as no different than fortune tellers before that. Remember, the people doing this work in the 19th century were Lady Bountifuls. That's how they were described. These were on the whole wealthy women who are often the wives of the industrial philanthropists we've talked about, who had free time on their hands and labor and notions of beneficence, and they would show up and at least the stories, the anecdotes we have, of course, are of families quivering in their boots whenever these Lady Bountifuls showed up, because they were concerned about the censorious attitudes that these people would bring with them. But these Lady Bountifuls are replaced by the development of a professionally trained paid labor force of social workers beginning in the second decade, really, of the 20th century, with the development of social work schools. The early social work schools are places like Columbia, NYU, et cetera. They're initially in places like New York, and they move out to other kinds of places afterwards. But by the 1950s and 60s, the center of social work schools, pretty sure, social workers can talk to this, the focus is increasingly on clinical social work. And it's only been recently. The one place that doesn't do that, by the way, is Hunter College. Hunter College really is the beacon, really, for group social work and not clinical work. But increasingly, that's become a rethinking, again, an effort to return to the roots of social work and bring those roots back into the profession.
We need to do. Absolutely. We need to get back to those activist, reformist social justice roots, not to denigrate clinical work. It's important, it's necessary, but we must balance the work of the profession with system reform as well.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together. I have really loved hearing from each of the three of you, and I'm grateful to our audience who have participated. So thank you for your questions. So thank you to our guests this evening, Dr. Linda Lausell Bryant, Dr. Ken Jackson, Dr. Daniel Walkowitz. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first of 4 discussions that we're having throughout 2021. The next one is June 24th. The title of it is Hope and Opportunity for New York City, Examining Social Services and Its Impact on Communities of Color. We only very quickly touched on issues of race during this discussion, but I knew it was coming up in June, so I'm looking forward to that conversation. And our panelists for that are Dr. Robin Manning Brown of the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, City University of New York, and Ann Williams-Isom, the James R. Dumpson Chair in Child Welfare at the Graduate School of Social Work at Fordham University. For our participants tonight, you will soon be receiving an email from Rising Ground to learn more about our work, and I hope you take a moment to read it and reply. As we conclude, I want to again thank our friends at Trinity Church Wall Street for facilitating this for us. Good evening, and I look forward to seeing you on June 24th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.